December 16th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Snow falls in heavy, silent curtains through the skeletal branches of ancient oaks, each flake catching what little light remains of the dying winter afternoon. The air carries the acrid smell of cordite and burning fuel, punctuated by the distant rumble of artillery that has become as constant as breathing for the men who fight here. In a makeshift prisoner collection point behind American lines, steam rises from tin cups of coffee. The rich aroma cutting through the metallic taste of war that clings to everything in this frozen hell. Captain Dmitri Volkov, of the 3rd Guards Tank Army, sits with his back against a splintered tree. His hands bound, but not tightly, watching with suspicious eyes as an American sergeant approaches with something that defies every expectation carved into his soul by 4 years of the Great Patriotic War. The sergeant carries a steaming cup of coffee and a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes, offerings that seem as foreign to Volkov as peace itself. This moment, repeated across dozens of prisoner compounds from the beaches of Normandy to the banks of the Elbe, would shatter preconceptions and reshape understanding in ways that no propaganda ministry could have predicted. For the Soviet soldiers who found themselves in American custody, the reality of their captivity would prove more disorienting than any interrogation technique their NKVD training had prepared them for. The winter of 1944 marked a turning point not just in the war, but in the collision of ideologies that would define the post-war world. By December, the Red Army had pushed the Wehrmacht back across Eastern Europe in a tide of blood and steel that left entire nations transformed. Soviet soldiers, hardened by the siege of Leningrad, the hell of Stalingrad, and the grinding advance through the ruins of German cities, carried with them expectations forged in the crucible of total war. They had seen what capture meant on the Eastern Front: mass executions, forced labor, systematic starvation. The Geneva Convention was a Western luxury that held no meaning in the apocalyptic struggle between fascism and communism. When fate or misfortune delivered these battle-hardened veterans into American hands, through friendly fire incidents, navigation errors, or the chaos of rapidly shifting front lines, they prepared themselves for torture, interrogation, and likely death. The Soviet military doctrine, reinforced by countless political education sessions, taught that capitalist armies were merely better-equipped versions of their fascist enemies. The Americans, they believed, would prove as ruthless as any SS unit, perhaps more so because they possessed the industrial capacity to make cruelty efficient. Captain Volkov had commanded a T-34 tank crew through the siege of Kursk, had seen his men incinerated by German Panzerfausts, had personally executed suspected collaborators in liberated Ukrainian villages. When his tank took a direct hit from what he later learned was an American Sherman in the confusion of converging Allied armies near the German border, he expected his capture to be a brief prelude to execution. The stories from Soviet soldiers who had encountered Western forces were few and often dismissed as propaganda, but they spoke of strange treatment that made no tactical sense. As the American sergeant extends the cup of coffee, Volkov sees in the gesture something that challenges the fundamental architecture of his worldview. The coffee is real. He can smell the rich, bitter aroma that speaks of abundance unknown to Soviet soldiers who have subsisted on ersatz grain coffee for months. The cigarettes are American Luckies, not the harsh Mahorka tobacco that Russian soldiers smoke when they can find it. But more disturbing than these material offerings is the expression on the American's face: genuine concern, perhaps even kindness. Emotions that have no place in the prisoner-captor relationship as Volkov understands it. The records of American prisoner of war facilities during World War II reveal a systematic approach to treatment that followed Geneva Convention protocols with almost bureaucratic precision. Unlike the Eastern Front, where survival rates for prisoners often fell below 10%, American POW camps maintained detailed records of medical care, caloric intake, and even recreational activities. A report from Camp McCain in Mississippi, dated January 1945, documents that German prisoners gained an average of 12 pounds during their captivity, subsisting on rations that exceeded those available to many American civilians under wartime rationing. For Soviet soldiers accustomed to a military culture where showing weakness invited execution, where political officers monitored every conversation for signs of ideological deviation, the American approach seemed like elaborate psychological warfare. Lieutenant Pavel Komarov, captured during a reconnaissance mission gone wrong near the Rhine, later wrote in a letter to his wife that was intercepted by Soviet censors, "They ask us about our families, about our homes, as if we were guests rather than enemies. The guards play cards with us. They share photographs of their sweethearts. I do not understand their strategy, but I find myself thinking of things I had forgotten. The taste of my mother's black bread, the sound of church bells in our village before the revolution." The transformation began not with grand gestures, but with accumulated small humanities. American medics treated Soviet wounds with the same care given to their own soldiers. Mess halls served portions that matched those given to American troops, complete with white bread, real butter, and meat at every meal. Most shocking of all, American officers made no attempt to extract military intelligence through torture or coercion. Interrogations consisted of polite questions asked in broken Russian or through interpreters, followed by respectful acceptance when prisoners invoked their right to provide only name, rank, and serial number. Sergeant First Class Michael O'Sullivan from Boston, who processed Soviet prisoners at a collection point near Pilsen, recorded in his diary, "These Russians come in expecting us to beat them, maybe shoot them outright. When we give them coffee and a hot meal, they look at us like we're playing some kind of trick. One of them started crying when I bandaged his wounded arm, not from pain, from confusion. They've been taught that we're monsters, and they can't figure out why we're treating them like human beings." The coffee became more than sustenance. It evolved into a symbol of American abundance that spoke to something deeper than material wealth. Each cup represented an economic system that could afford to give enemy prisoners luxuries that Soviet soldiers rarely experienced. The brewing process itself, performed openly in front of prisoners, demonstrated transparency that contradicted everything they had been taught about Western duplicity. There was no hidden agenda in the coffee ritual, no ulterior motive beyond the simple human act of offering warmth to someone who was cold. Major Alexei Petrov, a political officer captured during the final weeks of the war, found his ideological certainties crumbling with each sip of American coffee. He had dedicated his adult life to the Communist Party, had supervised the execution of hundreds of suspected traitors, had written reports praising Stalin's genius that earned him commendations and promotions. Yet sitting in an American POW camp, sharing cigarettes with guards who seemed genuinely interested in his stories about life in the Soviet Union, Petrov began to question truths he had considered immutable. "They waste nothing," he observed in a journal that would later be confiscated by Soviet intelligence upon his repatriation. Yet they have everything. The guards eat the same food as the prisoners. Their officers sleep in the same barracks as their men, only in separate rooms. There is no fear in their eyes when they speak to their superiors. The sergeants joke with the colonels. This should indicate poor discipline, but their army functions with efficiency that equals our own. I do not understand how authority can exist without terror. The documented experiences of Soviet POWs in American custody reveal a systematic exposure to democratic principles that operated below the level of conscious propaganda. Unlike German prisoners, who often shared cultural and historical references with their captors, Soviet soldiers encountered a fundamentally alien social structure. American military hierarchy, based on professional competence rather than political loyalty, demonstrated that authority could be exercised without the constant threat of execution. The casual equality between officers and enlisted men, the open discussion of orders and tactics, the absence of political commissars monitoring every conversation. These realities challenged the Soviet understanding of how human organizations functioned. The cigarettes, those lucky strikes and camels and Chesterfields carried their own symbolic weight. Unlike the harsh Russian makhorka or the ersatz tobacco substitutes that dominated wartime Europe, American cigarettes represented industrial sophistication and quality control that spoke to broader economic capabilities. But more significantly, they were shared freely between captor and captured, creating moments of human connection that transcended the formal prisoner-guard relationship. Soviet military doctrine prohibited fraternization with enemy forces, viewing any personal connection as potential treason. Yet American guards seemed to operate under no such restrictions, treating conversation and shared tobacco as natural extensions of basic human decency. The letters and diaries of Soviet POWs, many discovered decades later in KGB archives, reveal the psychological impact of this treatment. Colonel Viktor Romanenko, captured after his artillery unit was overrun during the Battle of the Bulge, wrote, "I have been prepared to die for the motherland, to sacrifice everything for victory over fascism. But I was not prepared for kindness from the enemy. It is more destructive to my certainties than any torture could have been. When the American doctor spent 3 hours operating to save my infected leg, asking nothing in return except that I rest and recover, I found myself weeping not from pain, but from confusion. In Soviet hospitals, even wounded heroes must often beg for attention. Yet here, as a prisoner, I receive care that exceeds what is given to their own soldiers." The winter of 1945 brought increasing numbers of Soviet soldiers into American custody as the converging Allied armies met along predetermined demarcation lines. Operation Keelhaul, the controversial Allied agreement to repatriate Soviet citizens regardless of their personal wishes, loomed over these encounters with the promise of uncertain fate for the prisoners upon their return home. Many Soviet POWs had heard rumors of what awaited those who had been captured: accusations of treason, interrogation by the NKVD, exile to labor camps in Siberia. The knowledge that their current comfort was temporary, that they would eventually face Stalin's suspicion of anyone who had survived enemy captivity, added poignancy to their American experience. Technical Sergeant William Kowalski, whose Polish-American background helped him communicate with Slavic prisoners, observed the growing anxiety as repatriation approached. You could see the fear in their eyes when they realized they'd have to go back. Some of them had started learning English, talking about America like it was some kind of promised land. They'd ask me about life in Detroit, where I grew up, about whether workers really owned automobiles and whether people could criticize the government without disappearing. When I told them yes, that my own father had argued with the mayor at town meetings, they looked at me like I was describing fairy tales. The coffee ritual evolved into something approaching communion as repatriation dates approached. American guards began to notice that Soviet prisoners would save portions of their coffee rations, not from scarcity, but from the desire to make the experience last longer. They understood intuitively that this small luxury represented something larger, a glimpse into a world where abundance was assumed rather than rationed, where individual dignity was respected rather than subsumed into collective identity. Captain Volkov, whose initial encounter with American coffee had seemed like elaborate psychological warfare, found himself defending American treatment to fellow prisoners who suspected capitalist tricks in every kindness. They gain nothing from deceiving us, he argued during a heated discussion in the prisoner barracks. We are already captured, already defeated. What purpose would false kindness serve? Perhaps. He paused, struggling with concepts that had no equivalent in his ideological vocabulary. Perhaps they treat us well because they believe this is how human beings should be treated. The statistical evidence supports the anecdotal accounts of exceptional treatment. Mortality rates among Soviet POWs in American custody remain below 2%, compared to mortality rates exceeding 50% for Soviet prisoners in German camps. Medical records show that captured Soviet soldiers received immunizations, dental care, and surgical procedures that many had never experienced in their entire lives. Educational programs taught basic English and introduced concepts of democratic governance that had been theoretical abstractions in communist political education. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, an Army nurse who worked with Soviet POWs at a hospital in France, wrote to her family, "These men have been through hell. You can see it in their eyes, in the way they flinch when doors slam, in how they eat every scrap of food as if it might be their last meal. But slowly, over weeks and months, you watch them remember how to laugh, how to trust, how to hope." Yesterday, one of them asked me if American women were allowed to become doctors. When I said yes, that I had studied at Harvard Medical School alongside men, he was silent for almost an hour. Finally, he said that in his village, the smartest person he knew was his sister, but she could only work in the collective farm. He wondered what she might have become in America. The symbolic power of American abundance extended beyond coffee and cigarettes to encompass the entire material culture of democratic capitalism. Soviet prisoners marveled at the casual waste that accompanied American military operations. Fresh food discarded rather than consumed, equipment replaced rather than endlessly repaired, supplies abundant enough that sharing with prisoners posed no hardship. This abundance contradicted fundamental assumptions about capitalist economics that portrayed Western workers as exploited and impoverished masses struggling under bourgeois oppression. As spring arrived in 1945 and Germany's surrender became inevitable, the psychological transformation of Soviet POWs accelerated. Many had begun to question not just American intentions, but the fundamental narratives that had shaped their understanding of the world. The coffee that had initially seemed like a tactical deception had become a daily reminder that their preconceptions about Western society might be fundamentally flawed. Senior Lieutenant Nikolai Volga, a tank commander who had participated in the liberation of Auschwitz, struggled to reconcile what he had witnessed of Nazi atrocities with the humane treatment he received from Americans. "The Germans were monsters," he wrote in a letter that would be censored by Soviet authorities. "But if the Americans are also our enemies, why do they act with such humanity?" My political officer taught us that fascism and capitalism were the same evil wearing different masks. Yet, I see no resemblance between the SS guards who murdered prisoners for sport and the American soldiers who share their rations with us. Either my education was incomplete, or the world is more complex than our ideology allows. The forced repatriation of Soviet POWs in the spring and summer of 1945 created profound moral dilemmas for American personnel who had witnessed the transformation of their charges. Operation Keelhaul required the return of all Soviet citizens to Stalin's control, regardless of their personal wishes or legitimate fears of persecution. Many American officers protested the policy, understanding that they were condemning men to probable death or imprisonment for the crime of having survived enemy captivity. Colonel James Patterson, who supervised a repatriation center in Austria, recorded his anguish in official reports that would remain classified for decades. These men have done nothing wrong except survive. They fought bravely for their country, were captured through no fault of their own, and conducted themselves with dignity while in our custody. Now we are forcing them onto trains that will carry them to interrogation, persecution, and likely death. Some have begged to remain, offering to work as laborers or translators. Others have attempted suicide rather than face repatriation. We are violating every principle of human decency in service of political expedience. The coffee cups, emptied for the final time as Soviet POWs prepared for repatriation, carried with them the weight of shattered assumptions and dangerous knowledge. These men had experienced firsthand the material abundance and human dignity that characterized American society, contradicting decades of communist propaganda about Western poverty and oppression. They had seen that authority could be exercised without terror, that abundance could be shared rather than hoarded, that individual worth could be recognized regardless of political orthodoxy. The fate of repatriated Soviet POWs remains one of the war's most tragic footnotes. Stalin's paranoia about potential Western contamination led to systematic persecution of anyone who had experienced life outside the Soviet sphere. Approximately 60% of repatriated prisoners were sent directly to labor camps, while others faced years of surveillance, employment restrictions, and social ostracism. The knowledge they carried about American society became a dangerous secret that could not be shared without risking further persecution. Yet the impact of their experience extended beyond individual tragedy to influence the broader Cold War dynamic. Soviet leadership recognized that American treatment of prisoners posed an ideological threat that exceeded any military advantage. Internal KGB reports from the late 1940s express concern about ideological contamination among repatriated prisoners and recommend increased surveillance of anyone who had extended contact with Western forces. The coffee and cigarettes that had seemed like simple gestures of humanity had become weapons in an ideological war that would define the next half-century. The children and grandchildren of Soviet POWs who experienced American captivity carried fragments of these stories across generations, whispered accounts of a world where abundance was assumed and dignity respected. Even in the depths of Stalinist repression, these memories persisted as evidence that alternatives to communist orthodoxy existed. The coffee that had warmed frozen hands in American POW camps became a symbol of possibility that would influence Soviet dissidents throughout the Cold War. Captain Dmitri Volkov, whose first encounter with American coffee had challenged his fundamental assumptions about capitalist society, died in a Siberian labor camp in 1953, condemned for ideological unreliability stemming from his period in Western captivity. His final letter to his wife, smuggled out by a sympathetic guard, contained a single haunting line: "Tell our son that there are places in this world where men share their coffee with strangers simply because sharing is the right thing to do." The coffee grew cold in those final hours before repatriation, but its symbolic power endured. In that simple gesture of offering warmth to the cold, sustenance to the hungry, comfort to the fearful, American soldiers had demonstrated the practical application of democratic principles that transcended political theory. They had shown that abundance shared diminishes no one, that dignity acknowledged enriches everyone, that humanity recognized becomes humanity multiplied. The steam that rose from those tin cups in the winter forests of 1944 carried with it the essence of a civilization built on the radical proposition that individual worth transcends political utility, that freedom is not a luxury but a necessity, that abundance is not a zero-sum competition but a shared inheritance of human ingenuity and cooperation. For Soviet soldiers, who had known only scarcity, fear, and political oppression, that first sip of American coffee tasted like the future itself, warm, rich, and impossibly full of promise.